The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Newark Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Destiny Williams sat in the last row, her heart beating fast against the manila envelope she held tightly to her chest. At 16, she was younger than most people in the courtroom, but her eyes held a determination that made her seem older than her years. The envelope contained 3 months of careful research, bank statements, certified letters, and documents that had taken her weeks to gather. Her grandmother's entire future rested in these papers, and Destiny knew she had only one chance to make things right. Sarah Williams, her grandmother, sat 5 rows ahead, her gray hair neatly pulled back in a bun, wearing her best Sunday dress. Even from behind, Destiny could see how her grandmother's shoulders trembled slightly. This was the first time in 30 years that Sarah had ever faced eviction from her home, and the unfairness of it all made Destiny's blood boil. As people shuffled into the courtroom, Destiny noticed Mr. Peterson, the property management company's lawyer, walking in with his expensive suit and leather briefcase. He barely glanced at the residents waiting for their cases to be heard. 3 other families from their apartment complex were also present, all facing similar eviction notices. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down from them, quietly wiped tears from her eyes. The bailiff's voice suddenly boomed through the room. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Michael Harrison presiding. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing behind him as he walked to his seat. He was a tall man with gray hair and glasses that sat low on his nose. He had a reputation for being strict but fair, though today he seemed distracted and tired. As everyone sat down, Destiny opened the envelope one more time, double-checking her documents. Her fingers traced over the bank statements showing her grandmother's rent payments, all made on time, all properly processed through their bank. Yet somehow, the management company claimed they never received 4 months of payments. Destiny had spent every evening after school for the past 3 months putting this case together. She would sit at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, while her grandmother cooked dinner. Sarah had tried to tell her not to worry, that maybe it was just their time to move on, but Destiny couldn't accept that. The apartment wasn't just their home. It was where Destiny had grown up, where her mother had raised her until the car accident 5 years ago. The walls held memories of birthday parties, holiday celebrations, and quiet evenings when her grandmother would tell stories about their family's history. The small garden her grandmother tended outside their window had helped feed many neighbors during tough times. Judge Harrison began calling cases, his voice monotone as he worked through the morning docket. Destiny watched as other residents presented their cases, most of them struggling to explain their situations. The judge seemed to be moving quickly, making swift decisions that mostly favored the property management company. As her grandmother's case drew closer, Destiny felt her palms grow sweaty. She had practiced what she wanted to say 100 times in front of her bedroom mirror, but now the words seemed to jumble in her head. The weight of her mother's old leather-bound law dictionary, which she had studied every night, seemed to press against her from her backpack. Case number 247, Sarah Williams versus Riverside Property Management, the clerk announced. Destiny watched her grandmother slowly rise from her seat. Sarah straightened her dress and walked forward, her head held high despite her obvious nervousness. Mr. Peterson smoothly approached the other table, arranging his documents with practiced efficiency. Judge Harrison looked down at his papers, then at Sarah. "Mrs. Williams, I understand you're representing yourself today." "Yes, Your Honor." Sarah's voice was soft but clear. As the judge began reviewing the case details, Destiny felt time slow down. She looked at the worn envelope in her hands, then at her grandmother standing alone before the court. The truth was right here, in black and white, but would anyone listen to a 16-year-old girl? Would she be brave enough to speak up when the moment came? The morning light had shifted, creating a spotlight effect in the courtroom. Destiny took a deep breath, knowing that everything was about to change. She just didn't know how much. The tension in the courtroom grew as Mr. Peterson, the property management's lawyer, began presenting his case against Sarah Williams. His words were sharp and practiced, painting a picture of a tenant who had supposedly failed to meet her obligations. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was the real story of Sarah Williams and her 30 years at Riverside Apartments. Sarah had moved into Riverside Apartments back when Destiny's mother was just a little girl. The neighborhood had been different then, rougher, more dangerous. But Sarah saw potential in both the building and its people. She started small, first by helping elderly Mrs. Chen from the third floor carry her groceries up the broken elevator. Then she began watching the Rodriguez children after school while their mother worked double shifts at the hospital. As Judge Harrison listened to Mr. Peterson's presentation, his eyes occasionally drifted to Sarah. She sat straight in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing the same dignified expression she had worn through 3 decades of community service. The judge couldn't know that just last week she had organized a study group for struggling students in her living room, or that her small community garden fed 5 families during the harsh winter months. Destiny watched from her seat as memories flooded her mind. She remembered the time when she was 7 and her grandmother had transformed the building's dirty basement into a makeshift library. Sarah had collected books from yard sales and donations, setting up old tables and chairs she'd found at thrift stores. Now, 10 years later, that library had helped dozens of neighborhood kids improve their reading scores. Mr. Peterson pulled out a stack of papers with flourish. "Your Honor, we have documentation showing 4 months of missed payments." Mrs. Williams signed a lease agreement clearly stating that 3 missed payments would result in immediate eviction proceedings. The lawyer's words hung in the air, but they couldn't erase the image of Sarah Williams working late into the night, organizing Christmas gift drives for families who couldn't afford presents. They couldn't erase the memory of her cooking soup for sick neighbors, or the way she kept spare school supplies in her apartment for children who needed them. From her seat, Destiny could see the other residents in the courtroom, Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Thompson, and the Lee family, all silently supporting her grandmother. Each of them had their own stories about Sarah's kindness. Mr. Thompson still had the spare key Sarah had used last year when she rescued his cat during a fire alarm. Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter had gotten into college thanks to Sarah's help with applications and essays. The judge shuffled through some papers, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Williams, do you have any response to these allegations?" Sarah stood slowly, her voice soft but clear. "Your Honor, I've never missed a payment in 30 years. I have receipts." She began searching through her small folder, but Destiny could see her grandmother's hands shaking. The receipts Sarah had were incomplete. Some had been lost during a water leak last spring. What her grandmother didn't know was that Destiny had spent weeks tracking down bank records and building a complete case file. "Your Honor," Mr. Peterson interrupted smoothly, "if Mrs. Williams can't provide proper documentation, we must insist on immediate evacuation of the premises." A murmur of discontent rippled through the courtroom. Destiny's heart pounded as she watched her grandmother struggling to organize her papers. The morning sun now streamed directly through the windows, illuminating the worry lines on Sarah's face. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Mrs. Williams, without proper documentation." Destiny's fingers tightened around her manila envelope. Inside were not just bank statements and receipts, but letters from residents, photographs of community events, and newspaper clippings about her grandmother's work in the building. 30 years of service and dedication were about to be erased by a company's fraudulent claims. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Harrison began to speak again, his words carrying the weight of an impending decision. Destiny knew that everything, her home, her grandmother's life work, their entire community, hung in the balance. The moment to act was approaching, and she could feel her mother's spirit urging her forward. 3 months earlier, Destiny had started her investigation at the local library. While other teenagers spent their afternoons hanging out with friends or watching videos, she sat at a corner table surrounded by stacks of papers and her mother's old laptop. The eviction notice that had arrived that morning had changed everything. Each day after school, Destiny would take the bus to different places: the bank, the county records office, and even the post office. At the bank, Mrs. Martinez, who had known Destiny since she was a little girl, helped her get copies of all her grandmother's bank statements. The papers showed something interesting. Every single rent payment had been withdrawn from their account on time. "Your mother would be proud," Mrs. Martinez had said, printing another statement. She had the same look in her eyes when she was working on a case. Destiny's mother had been a lawyer before the accident, and her old law books still filled the shelves at home. Late at night, while her grandmother slept, Destiny spread papers across their kitchen table. She created a timeline, using different colored sticky notes to track each payment. Yellow for bank withdrawals, blue for the management company's claims, and pink for the dates when other residents had also reported missing payments. One night, while reviewing the documents for the 10th time, Destiny noticed something strange. She pulled out her phone and called Maria Rodriguez, who lived 2 doors down. "Mrs. Rodriguez, can you tell me which months the management company said they didn't receive your rent?" The pattern that emerged was shocking. The missing payments aligned perfectly with the months when the management company had raised the rent for new tenants. It seemed they were targeting long-term residents who still paid the older, lower rates. Destiny remembered how her mother used to prepare for court cases. She had kept detailed notes, made copies of everything, and always said that presentation mattered as much as facts. Following her mother's example, Destiny organized her evidence carefully. She created clear charts showing payment patterns, gathered statements from other residents, and even photographed the certified mail receipts that proved payments had been sent. The investigation led her to the city's housing authority, where she discovered something even more disturbing. 3 other apartment buildings managed by the same company had similar complaints. Destiny met with former residents who had already been evicted. Their stories were heartbreaking, but they provided more evidence of the company's tactics. One rainy evening, while adding new documents to her file, Destiny found an old newspaper article about her mother. Rachel Williams had won a case protecting elderly residents from unfair eviction. The article quoted her saying, "Sometimes justice needs a little help finding its way." Looking at her mother's smiling face in the photograph, Destiny felt tears rolling down her cheeks. Now, sitting in the courtroom, watching Judge Harrison review the property management's claims, Destiny thought about all the nights she had spent building this case. She thought about Mr. Lee, who had lost his apartment last month, about Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, who had helped translate documents, about all the residents who had shared their stories, their fears, and their trust with her. The manila envelope in her hands contained more than just papers. It held the truth about a company that was slowly destroying the community. It showed how they lost payments from specific residents, how they changed records, and how they targeted the most vulnerable tenants first. Judge Harrison's voice brought Destiny back to the present moment. He was asking her grandmother about payment records, but Sarah was struggling to find the right documents in her folder. Mr. Peterson, the management company's lawyer, had a small smile on his face, clearly thinking he had already won. Destiny's heart raced as she watched her grandmother's hands trembling. The evidence that could save not just their home, but the homes of many others, sat in her lap. The moment she had prepared for during all those late nights was approaching. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes justice needs a little help finding its way. The sun streaming through the courthouse windows felt warm on her face, like her mother's encouraging smile. Destiny took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the envelope that held 3 months of careful investigation. She knew what she had to do. Mr. Peterson's voice filled the courtroom as he continued presenting his case against Sarah Williams. He walked back and forth in front of the judge's bench, pointing to charts that showed supposed missed payments. Each time he mentioned a missing payment, Destiny felt her heart beat faster, knowing she had proof that would contradict his claims. "Your Honor," Mr. Peterson said, straightening his expensive tie, "Riverside Property Management has been more than patient with Mrs. Williams. We have sent multiple notices, made numerous phone calls, and given her every opportunity to resolve this situation." He paused for effect, glancing at Sarah with what looked like practiced sympathy. Judge Harrison nodded along, making notes on his legal pad. From her seat in the back, Destiny could see how the judge's shoulders seemed to slump slightly, as if the weight of dozens of similar cases had worn him down. He had already processed 4 eviction cases that morning, each one ending in favor of the property management company. Sarah Williams sat at her table alone, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she shuffled through her incomplete paperwork. A receipt slipped from her fingers and floated to the floor. When she bent to pick it up, Destiny saw how her grandmother's hands were shaking. Furthermore, Mr. Peterson continued, walking over to his table and picking up another document. Mrs. Williams signed a lease addendum last year acknowledging that 3 missed payments would result in immediate eviction proceedings. We have documented 4 missed payments. The other residents in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her rosary beads, whispering silent prayers. Mr. Thompson, who had lived in the building for 20 years, shook his head slowly. They all knew they could be next. Judge Harrison looked up from his notes. Mrs. Williams, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations? Sarah stood slowly, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. Yes, Your Honor. I've never missed a payment in 30 years. I have some receipts here. She began searching through her folder again, papers rustling loudly in the quiet courtroom. Your Honor, Mr. Peterson interrupted. If Mrs. Williams cannot provide proper documentation, we must insist on proceeding with the eviction order. The company has properties to manage, and we cannot allow tenants to remain in residence without proper payment. Destiny watched as her grandmother's shoulders slumped slightly. Sarah had always been the strong one, the one who held their community together, but now she looked small and vulnerable under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, looking down at the papers before him. Mrs. Williams, without proper documentation of these payments, I'm afraid I have no choice but to. The morning sun suddenly broke through the clouds outside, sending a shaft of light through the tall courthouse windows. It illuminated the judge's bench, catching the silver frame of a small photograph that sat to his left. From her seat, Destiny could just make out the image. A group of young law clerks standing on these same courthouse steps, among them a familiar face that made her heart stop. Her mother, Rachel Williams, smiled out from that photo, standing proud in her first job as a law clerk for Judge Harrison. Destiny hadn't known about this connection, but now everything seemed to click into place. The way the judge had glanced at her when she entered the courtroom, the slight pause when he had read her grandmother's name. The manila envelope felt heavy in Destiny's hands. Inside were not just bank statements and payment records, but the truth about a system that was pushing out families who had lived in the building for decades. Her mother had fought against similar injustices, standing in this very courtroom. Judge Harrison began to speak again, his words carrying the weight of what seemed to be an inevitable decision. Destiny could see Mr. Peterson's slight smile, could feel the despair radiating from her grandmother's slumped shoulders. The moment she had prepared for during all those late nights was here. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "Stand up for what's right, even when your voice shakes." Destiny took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the envelope tightly. It was time. Judge Harrison's gavel hovered in the air as he prepared to make his ruling. The courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of Sarah Williams's shaky breathing. Mr. Peterson stood confidently by his table, already reaching for his briefcase, clearly expecting another easy victory. In the matter of Riverside Property Management versus Sarah Williams, Judge Harrison began, his voice heavy with authority, based on the evidence presented. Bank Statement S. The words burst from Destiny's lips before she could stop them. They echoed off the high ceiling of the courtroom, causing every head to turn toward the back row. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she forced herself to stand, clutching the manila envelope like a shield. Judge Harrison's face turned pale as his eyes found her. The gavel in his hand froze midair, then slowly lowered to the bench. For a moment, he looked as if he had seen a ghost, and in a way he had. Standing before him was the spitting image of Rachel Williams, his former law clerk, whose passionate pursuit of justice had inspired many of his own rulings. "Young lady," he said, his voice slightly unsteady, "this is a court of law. You can't simply—" "I have evidence," Destiny said, her voice stronger now as she stepped into the aisle. She held up the envelope. 3 months of investigation, bank records, proof of payment, everything. Mr. Peterson's confident smile faltered. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This child has no standing in these proceedings." But Judge Harrison wasn't listening to him. His eyes were fixed on Destiny as she walked forward, her head held high just like her mother used to do. The same determined set of the jaw, the same fire in her eyes. He remembered Rachel Williams standing in this very courtroom, fighting for justice with that same unwavering conviction. "I'm Sarah Williams's granddaughter," Destiny continued, approaching the bench. "And Rachel Williams was my mother. She taught me that justice sometimes needs help finding its way." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. Everyone could see the resemblance now, not just to Rachel, but to the spirit of justice she had represented in this very courthouse. "Your Honor," Mr. Peterson tried again, "we can't allow every child with a folder full of papers to interrupt court proceedings." "These aren't just papers," Destiny said, turning to face him. These are bank statements showing every payment my grandmother made. These are certified mail receipts proving when they were sent. These are statements from other residents showing the same pattern of lost payments. Sarah Williams stood up slowly, tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched her granddaughter. She had no idea Destiny had been investigating, had been fighting silently all this time. Other residents in the courtroom began to stand too. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Thompson, the Lee family, all of them victims of the same suspicious pattern. Judge Harrison looked at the photograph on his desk, then back at Destiny. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught her face just right, and for a moment, it was as if Rachel Williams herself stood before him again, fighting for what was right. "Approach the bench," he said quietly, his judicial demeanor softening slightly. Both parties. As Destiny walked forward with her envelope of evidence, she felt her mother's presence strongly. The same courthouse, the same judge, the same fight for justice. It was as if history was repeating itself, but this time through her. Mr. Peterson's expensive shoes clicked angrily against the floor as he joined them, his earlier confidence replaced by nervous tension. The judge looked down at Destiny, his face still pale, but his eyes now alert and focused. "Young lady," he said, "your mother once stood right where you're standing now. She taught me something important about looking beyond the surface of cases like these." He held out his hand for the envelope. "Show me what you found." With trembling fingers but a steady voice, Destiny began presenting her evidence to Judge Harrison. She pulled out document after document, laying them carefully on his bench in the same organized way her mother used to prepare her cases. The morning sun highlighted the neat sticky notes she had used to mark important details. "Your Honor, these are my grandmother's bank statements for the past 3 years," she said, placing the first stack of papers before him. The yellow highlights show each rent payment being withdrawn from her account. Not a single month was missed. Mr. Peterson shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Your Honor, bank withdrawals don't prove the company received the payments." "I thought you might say that," Destiny replied, pulling out another set of documents. "These are the certified mail receipts, showing when each payment was sent and signed for by your office." She spread out the green postal receipts, each one signed by someone at the management company's office. Judge Harrison leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he examined the receipts. His eyes moved between the bank statements and the postal records, seeing how they matched perfectly. The pale color had left his face, replaced by a growing look of concern. "But there's more," Destiny continued, her confidence growing. She pulled out a chart she had created, color-coded and clearly labeled. "This shows the pattern. Every time the management company raised rent for new tenants, they claimed they lost payments from long-term residents who were still paying lower rates." Mrs. Rodriguez stood up from her seat. "It's true, Your Honor. They said they lost my payments too, the same months as Mrs. Williams." The judge raised his hand for silence, but his eyes never left the documents. He picked up another paper from Destiny's file, a newspaper clipping about similar complaints at other properties managed by the same company. Mr. Peterson's face had turned red. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. You can't possibly take the word of a child over a licensed property management company." "She's not just any child," Judge Harrison said quietly, looking at the photograph on his desk. "She's Rachel Williams's daughter, and she's brought more organized evidence than your company has presented." He turned to Destiny. "Continue, young lady." Destiny pulled out statements from other residents, each one showing the same pattern. She had collected their bank records, their postal receipts, their stories. Page after page showed how the management company had targeted long-term residents, claiming missing payments that were actually received. Sarah Williams watched from her table, tears flowing freely now. She had no idea her granddaughter had been working so hard, gathering evidence, building a case. Other residents in the courtroom nodded as Destiny spoke, their own experiences confirming every word. "And finally, Your Honor," Destiny said, pulling out the last document. "This is a letter from the State Housing Authority. They've received similar complaints about this company from 3 other apartment buildings." Judge Harrison studied the letter carefully. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of papers being shuffled and Mr. Peterson's increasingly agitated breathing. The morning sun had moved higher, filling the courtroom with clear light that seemed to highlight the truth laid bare on the judge's bench. "In all my years on the bench," Judge Harrison said finally, looking up from the documents. "I've rarely seen evidence presented so clearly." He turned to Mr. Peterson, whose confident demeanor had completely crumbled. "Would you care to explain these discrepancies?" Mr. Peterson tugged at his tie nervously. "Your Honor, I'll need to consult with my clients." "I'm sure you will," the judge replied firmly. He turned back to Destiny, his eyes soft with memory. "Your mother once stood in this courtroom and taught me to look deeper, to see the people behind the paperwork. She would be very proud today." Destiny felt tears forming in her eyes, but she stood tall, just as her mother would have done. Behind her, she could hear her grandmother's soft sobs of relief and the murmurs of hope from other residents. The evidence was clear, the truth was out, and justice was finally finding its way. Judge Harrison's courtroom had become the center of something much bigger than one grandmother's eviction case. After reviewing all of Destiny's evidence, the judge called for a brief recess. When he returned, his face was stern with purpose. "Based on the evidence presented," he announced, his voice filling the quiet courtroom, "I am ordering an immediate stay on all eviction proceedings by Riverside Property Management." He looked directly at Mr. Peterson, who had been frantically texting on his phone. "Furthermore, I am requesting a full investigation into their practices." The courtroom erupted in whispers and soft cries of relief. Sarah Williams reached for her granddaughter's hand, squeezing it tightly, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "Ms. Williams," he said, addressing Destiny with the respect usually reserved for attorneys, "your investigation has uncovered what appears to be a systematic attempt to remove long-term residents. Would you be willing to share your findings with the district attorney's office?" Destiny stood tall, just as her mother would have done. "Yes, Your Honor. I've made copies of everything." Over the next 2 weeks, Destiny's evidence sparked a wave of investigations. She sat in meetings with city officials, housing authorities, and investigators, explaining her careful research. Her colored charts and organized timeline became the backbone of a larger investigation into not just Riverside Property Management, but several other companies connected to them. More residents came forward with similar stories. Mr. Lee, who had been evicted the previous month, returned to the courthouse with his own stack of payment receipts. Mrs. Chen's granddaughter helped translate for elderly Chinese residents who had been afraid to speak up. Each new story confirmed the pattern Destiny had uncovered. Sarah watched with pride as her granddaughter handled questions from investigators with the same quiet confidence she remembered in Rachel. "You're just like your mother?" she told Destiny one evening as they sat in their kitchen. She never could stand by when something wasn't right. The local newspaper ran a story about the case. They printed a picture of Destiny standing on the courthouse steps, holding her manila envelope of evidence. Next to it, they placed an old photo of Rachel Williams from her days as a young lawyer. The resemblance was striking, the same determined expression, the same sense of purpose. Judge Harrison took a special interest in the investigation. He'd assigned one of his best clerks to help sort through the growing mountain of evidence. Together, they discovered that the management company had been using similar tactics in other cities, always targeting long-term residents who paid lower rents. Mr. Peterson stopped coming to court. His law firm issued a statement saying they had dropped Riverside Property Management as a client. New lawyers arrived, looking nervous as they tried to explain their clients' actions. The housing authority set up a special hotline for residents to report similar cases. It rang constantly. Each call revealed another piece of the puzzle, showing how deep the problem went. Destiny's careful investigation had opened the door for others to speak up. One afternoon, as Destiny was leaving the courthouse after another meeting, Judge Harrison called her into his chambers. On his desk sat the photo she had noticed that first day, the one with her mother among his law clerks. "Your mother changed how I saw things," he told her, looking at the photo with misty eyes. "She taught me that justice isn't just about laws and papers. It's about people, about communities." He turned to Destiny. "You've done the same thing, young lady. You've reminded this old judge to look deeper." Back at Riverside Apartments, things were changing. The management company's office stood empty, with a notice of investigation taped to the door. Residents who had been afraid to speak to each other now gathered in the community room, sharing their stories and their hopes for the future. Sarah's garden continued to grow, and now more residents were helping tend it. The basement library Destiny had mentioned in court was busier than ever. It had become a meeting place where residents gathered to discuss the case and support each other. The investigation was far from over, but something important had already changed. People walked the halls of Riverside Apartments with their heads held higher, knowing that one 16-year-old girl with a manila envelope had stood up and made justice find its way. 3 months after Destiny stood up in Judge Harrison's courtroom, the investigation reached its conclusion. On a bright autumn morning, residents of Riverside Apartments gathered in the community room to hear the final results. The same room where Sarah Williams had hosted so many community events was now packed with families, reporters, and city officials. Destiny sat beside her grandmother in the front row, wearing her mother's old blazer that Sarah had carefully preserved. Judge Harrison stood at the front of the room, his judicial robes replaced by a regular suit, but his presence still commanding respect. The investigation into Riverside Property Management has revealed systematic fraud affecting hundreds of residents, he announced, his voice grave. The company has agreed to a settlement that includes full repayment of all disputed rent claims, plus damages, to every affected resident. A wave of relief swept through the room. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself, whispering prayers of thanks. Mr. Thompson, who had finally returned to his old apartment, wiped tears from his eyes. The Lee family hugged each other tightly. Furthermore, the judge continued, the city has approved the creation of a resident advisory board to oversee future management decisions. He smiled at Sarah Williams. And I'm pleased to announce that Mrs. Sarah Williams has been appointed as the board's first chairperson. Sarah gasped softly, squeezing Destiny's hand. After 30 years of unofficial community service, her role as a leader was finally being recognized. The room erupted in applause, with many residents standing to cheer for the woman who had helped them all for so long. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. None of this would have been possible without the remarkable work of one young person. He turned to Destiny. Ms. Williams, your investigation didn't just save your grandmother's home. It exposed a pattern of fraud that was hurting families across the city. Your mother would be incredibly proud. The district attorney's office had used Destiny's carefully organized evidence as the foundation for their case. Her color-coded charts now hung in the courthouse as an example of citizen investigation done right. The management company's executives faced criminal charges, and their other properties were under new, honest management. More changes had come to Riverside Apartments. The community garden Sarah tended had expanded, with residents working together to grow fresh vegetables. The basement library where Destiny had spent so many hours now had new books, donated by the city library system. Even the old elevator had been repaired. But the biggest change was in the residents themselves. People who had once been afraid to speak up now attended monthly board meetings, sharing their ideas and concerns. The sense of community that Sarah had nurtured for 30 years grew stronger every day. After the meeting, as residents gathered for a celebration lunch, Judge Harrison pulled Destiny aside. I have something for you, he said, handing her an envelope. Inside was an offer for a paid internship at the legal aid office where her mother had started her career. You have a natural talent for investigation and a passion for justice, he told her. Just like Rachel did. The legal aid office could use someone like you, even if it's just part-time after school. Destiny looked at the envelope, then at her grandmother chatting happily with neighbors, and finally at her mother's photograph on the wall. 3 generations of Williams women, each fighting for justice in their own way. She thought about all the other buildings, all the other families who might need someone to speak up for them. I'd be honored, she said, thinking of how her mother would have smiled. Later that evening, as the sun set over Riverside Apartments, Destiny sat with her grandmother in their kitchen. The same kitchen where she had spread out her evidence late at night, where she had built her case piece by piece. Sarah served her granddaughter a slice of her famous sweet potato pie. Your mother always said that justice was like my garden, Sarah said softly. It needs people to tend it, to help it grow. She looked at Destiny with pride. You've done that, baby. You've helped justice grow. Destiny smiled, looking out the window at the community garden below, where new flowers were blooming alongside the vegetables. In her pocket, she could feel the internship offer letter. Above her, on the shelf, her mother's law books seemed to stand a little straighter. Sometimes justice needed a little help finding its way, and sometimes that help came from a 16-year-old girl with a manila envelope and the courage to stand up in court.